Yeah. That's.
Let's get started. Our speaker's got a lot to share. Obviously, Dick needs no introduction. I've followed Dick from the 60s at Myrtle Creek to downtown Portland and St. Mark's, Lewis and Clark. Dick is the retired professor, Paul S. Wright Professor Emeritus at Lewis and Clark. He's going to take us from an itinerant preacher in the first century to this rather ragtag, sophisticated group here at Westminster. Dick, it's all yours.
Well, good morning. Every year I do this, I keep saying this is the last one I can hold.
That's right.
And you're going to say it's tougher. I gave away my library. The other problem is I've been doing this for 30 years. And I know that you remember everything I ever said, but I don't. So I don't know if I repeat myself or not. But we'll do the best we can. Subject I want to take on today in the next couple of weeks is important. It's important not only spiritually, religiously, theologically, it's important because of who we are. So what I want to trace over the next couple of weeks is how Christianity moved from the very lowest, the very bottom of the social register to the very top. And what some of the consequences that were as a result of that, how that changed the faith forever. And how we cannot go back, but now we are in a position of trying to follow the path of Jesus in a society very different from the one in which it began. So, to get started, if I can get all this perfect. We need to start by reminding ourselves of the social level in which Jesus was born. I know that it's not news to anybody. We've said it over and over and over again. You've heard it many ways, times, and places that Jesus was born at the bottom of the social level. But we need to rethink the level, and I know that I've done that here before. And I don't want to beat it to death, but I want to draw some new information from it that we haven't talked about in these classes before. So, I want to walk through the social pyramid of antiquity. I'll do it quickly, and I want to highlight at least two things that we can draw out of that picture that are important for our story and for us today. So the social pyramid went like this. Like us, they had a 1%. At the top of the ladder were the royal families, the high-ranking military officers, priests, aristocratic families, and so on. Their wealth came from landowning and taxation, both important. Important not only to them, but also for what happened to Christianity. They maintain control of writing. That's the biggest one on this list. Coinage, taxation, military, and judicial system. So it's also worth thinking about how these people lived, because we have a contemporary example. They had large mansions, gated and walled, in the city central. But they also had country estates that they could flee to when necessary, as for example, when there were epidemics. So, these people, one of the things I want to draw out of this is what was their attitude toward religion? And I want to look at that for each step in the social register. For these people, they used religion to justify their God-given authority and have it regularly put in front of everybody in the population. That might sound a little familiar to you. It's a phenomenon that occurs in our society today, was prevalent in antiquity. Now, if you want to understand how these people lived, all you got to do is think Trump Tower and Mar-a-Lago. City residents and the country estate. Same thing, nothing has changed. Now, in addition to their attitude toward religion, the other thing I want to think about is their role in the Jesus story. So you very quickly can discover that the role of the 1% in the Jesus story is very, very small. They really only appear at the time of his trial and crucifixion. They play a very minor role in the story of Paul. And once again, they are only really prominent at the time of his arrest and imprisonment. Well, when we get to the era of Constantine, these people will play an enormous role. Not only in the body politic, but in the church. So the changing role of this segment of the population is one of the things I want to think about. And I want to think about their attitude toward religion to justify their own position and existence. Now let's go to the next group. They are what scholars call retainers. The term is not, but we can get the idea. Lower level military officers, officials, bureaucrats, clerks, bailiffs, lawyers, all of this kind of stuff. That would include, by the way, what we in our society call the deep state. You understand? They were about 5 to 7% of the population in antiquity. That's also true today. They worked primarily to extend the control of the 1% across the society, even into the rural areas and villages. That was their role in life. How did they think about religion? Also important. To them, religion was the principal means of displaying their loyalty to the system. Sound familiar? They had to stay in the good graces of the 1%. That's going to affect the way they interact with Christianity and become part of it. Their life chances depended on this. So if you think the professional and managerial class in America, including the current role of many American evangelical leaders in the current administration, you'll get the idea. What about their role in the story? These people play a very significant role in the Jesus story, but they are primarily Jesus' opponents. The scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees were the retainer class of ancient society. They are almost entirely the antagonists in the story, the enemies of Jesus. They also play an important role in the world of Paul. They do because they eventually will become the congregational leaders in the church of Paul's day. They were not in the church in large numbers, but their role was prominent and important. They play a huge role in the Christianity of Constantine's era. In fact, they become a key part of the governmental bureaucracy itself. And therefore, their role in both the body politic and in the church is enormous. Next, what I'm calling now the nameless urbanites. The urban poor were about 85% of the population of the city, but they were a much smaller percentage of the entire population of the society. Only about 3 to 7% of the total population, 85% of the city. These were merchants, artisans, day laborers, shopkeepers, that kind of stuff. The economic situation of urban poor or urban nameless could vary from considerable wealth among merchants to dire poverty among the poorest of the poor. Near the bottom of that social class would have been the day laborers, one of whom, folks, is Jesus. He is not in a city, though. We'll talk about that a little more, but he is clearly a day laborer. These people, even the rich among them, bore very little social influence. They did not have roles in government to any degree. They were a servant class to a greater degree than others, and therefore they bore very, very little social influence and importance. And by the way, the life expectancies of particularly the poorer folks in the cities were very short. Shorter than the life expectancies of farmers in the villages. A study done by Thomas Carney at the University of Kansas concluded that the life expectancy of a person born in the lower classes of the urban areas of the Roman Empire had a life expectancy of 20 years. Now, what about religion? For them, religion was a way to gain support from the group devoted. They participated heavily in the religious world of the Rome and the Greek cities of that period. But they did so primarily because it was their access to any resources, influence, and advantage they could get. Now, if you want to think about who these people were, think about the slums and the rundown city areas of American cities. Now you have the idea. Think about the south side of Chicago or places like that. Folks, nothing had changed. What about their role in the Jesus story? These people play almost no role in the Jesus story. And they don't because, at least according to the Gospels, Jesus was never in a city, except the week of his death. That varies in the Gospels. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is in Jerusalem once, the time of his death. In John, he's there 3 times. But it's very clear that the life and ministry of Jesus was not in an urban environment. Therefore, these people play almost no role in the gospel story. They are, however, a primary group for Paul's ministry, which was almost entirely in Greco-Roman cities. And so these people will become an important constituency in the early churches that develop, and an important concern in the ministry life teachings of the Apostle Paul. In the Constantinian area, they play almost no public role in the church or in society. That does not mean they are not present. It means they have no public influence. They remained part of local congregations, and there is evidence of considerable concern for them in early Christian congregations. But they play no public role in the story whatever. Next, rural peasants and other villagers. This is the overwhelming bulk of the population in antiquity. Note that we are skipping from urban down to farmers. We haven't talked about a middle class. We haven't because there wasn't one. Certainly nothing remotely like anything in a modern society, including homes. So come to the rural peasants and the villagers, 75 to 80% of the population. They were primarily engaged in two things. One was farming, and the other was the extracting of raw materials, mining. That occupied almost all of them. Their economic margin of survival was so thin that life was precarious. There is no other way to put it. Debt, leading to loss of land, was an absolute epidemic. And almost certainly the family of Jesus was a victim of that. Remember, he's born in Bethlehem. Why is he in a drinkwater little town, Nazareth? Population maybe 150. In other words, he's landless, hence a day laborer, and hence near the bottom of this sort of plot. Fishermen and herders were common. The antiquity don't respect fishermen. I have a personal beef with that. Fishermen and herders, common well spot. Of course, they're village artisans and craftsmen, all kinds, carpenters. Many of them were day laborers, and we need to think about that. They still exist in our culture. If you go down to 6th and Davis in Portland in the morning, you will see a group of men standing there just hanging around. What they are, folks, is they're waiting for day labor. Working for day wages. Nothing has changed. They could not make a living in small villages like Nazareth. That meant that day laborers in the village areas traveled around. Anybody in antiquity who traveled around was considered a social deviant. So, all of them were illiterate. Oral communication was their only option. What about their view of religion? For these people, it was a desperate plea for grace and mercy from God or anybody. Life was so precarious for these people that religion became a consolation, but also a plea, a desperate plea for some kind of help. Now, before we look at their role in the Jesus story, I want to go to the last group, another group that also exists in America. What scholars call the degraded, the unclean, and the expendables. Outside every pre-industrial city, people lived who were beggars, prostitutes, the poorest day laborers, canners. They couldn't live in the cities because they stunk. They smelled. People didn't want them around. Bandits, sailors, gamblers, all these companies, even some merchants. Now, they were about 10% of the total population. They were around the edges of both the cities and the villages, though obviously in far greater numbers. Their living conditions were simply appalling. What about their view of religion? Not too different from that of the farming peasants. Desperate hope that God would save them. You want to understand who they are? Go to downtown Portland and look for homeless folks. Folks, nothing has changed. The homeless population of America, which has grown quite markedly in recent years, is replicating what happened in the cities of the ancient world. So, what about their role in the Jesus story? Well, peasants, that is the farming group, peasants and the degraded and expendables were the primary focus of the entire life and ministry of Jesus. He was one of them and spoke to them. They play a very minor role in Paul's story. They are present. You can see them around the edges of some of the stories and texts. There is evidence of concern for them in early Pauline congregations, but there were not large numbers of these people in the congregations, as there would be at other times. What about the story of Constantine? At that level, they play no public role, whatever. We know they existed. We can see concern for them. We can say criticism of people in the church who were not concerned about them. But they play no public role in either Christianity of that era or in society itself. Now, I want to think for a little bit more about these people for a second. I want to sort of remind us of how focused the teachings of Jesus were on these people. For example, blessed are those who hunger. Blessed are those who thirst. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are those who weep now. Blessed are the lowly ones. That gets translated in the King James, blessed are the meek. Bad translation. It means to know that the people are worth nothing in the eyes of society. Blessed are you when people hate you, exclude you, insult you, and reject your name as evil. Sound familiar? What about the Lord's Prayer? Give us today our daily bread. Who prayed that prayer? A day laborer. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Who was in debt? Interestingly, it was not the poor in the cities. It was the poor in the countryside who were losing their land. Save us from the evil one. Talk about bad translation. We translate in the Lord's Prayer, and deliver us from temptation. That is not what it means in the Greek. Deliver us from temptation, keep us from evil. In the Greek, it's deliver us from the evil one. Who in ancient literature was the evil one? It was the judges in the debt courts. The Lord's Prayer could not have come out of the top social register of antiquity. Think about these kinds of stories. Healing, sick, lame, and blind. Feeding. Casting out a demon called legion. If you don't get the point of legion, you're missing it. And where do the demons that are called legion, where do they get, what happens to them? They get thrown into the pigs and they go in the lake and drown. And that's exactly what ought to happen to the legions. Think about breaking bread together. Think about breaking bread together. An item of no comment in the upper classes of society. A life-changing event for people at the bottom. Think about Jesus' own mission statement. Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, release to captives. That was probably, not probably, by the way, is a reference to the debtors. Because in antiquity, if you can't pay the debt, we're going to throw you in jail till your relatives pay it and get you out. Recovery of sight to the blind, let the oppressed go free. So, when you think about the social register of antiquity, I want to think especially about the role of various groups in the Jesus story. I want to think about their attitude toward religion. And I want to think about what happens to the message of Jesus as we move from one group to the next. That's what we're going to concentrate on. Oh, we know that big change was coming. Think about this is mind-boggling. If that's where we started, within 20 years, Paul was writing letters to literate Christians in large cities, in a different culture, and in a different language. That is absolutely mind-boggling. If Jesus died, we can't date it precisely. But perhaps somewhere around the year 27, 28, Paul writes to the Christians in Thessalonica, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians in the year 49. That we can date. In 20 years, that change had occurred. Within 40 years, Mark was putting the whole Jesus story into writing. We don't know exactly when it was written, but a good guess is the year 68. It seems to have been written just prior to the Jewish-Roman War in the year 70. So by 40 years after the lifetime of Jesus, we now have the entire Jesus story in writing. We are going to discover that that one change, writing, had more impact on early Christianity than almost anything that occurred. And I'm going to tell you that story next week and show you the implications of it. That was absolutely earth-shattering. So our challenge in this class is, I want to look at the huge and irreversible changes in Christianity from its beginnings in the lifetime of Jesus to 4 centuries later at the time of Constantine, when it's at the top of the social register. Now, we gotta do a little homework before we can do this. Okay. We gotta think about a concept that scholars, I wrote my PhD dissertation on this subject. We gotta think about a concept that scholars talk a lot about, what we call the social location of thought. Now, I'm sorry for the academic lingo, but the concept is not hard to understand, and it's important. Let me show you. It's the idea that ways of thinking, speaking, and language, even vocabulary, all shaped by the social location in which they appear. So if we're going to talk about Christianity's migration from one social location to the next, we got to think about what happens to Christian vocabulary, thinking, ways of talking, so on. Very easy to illustrate this, by the way, with language. And that's because words, do you like academic lingo? Words, so scholars say, are polyvalent. What that means in ordinary talk is words have multiple meanings. Okay? And the meaning of a given word depends on the context, the place in which it's used. For example, if I use the word bank, am I talking about the edge of a river or a financial institution? Well, obviously it depends on the context, right? If I use the word diamond, am I talking about something that's on your finger, or am I talking about a place to play baseball? It depends on the context. That is true of all language, in all languages, and it has an enormous impact on what happens when the Jesus movement changes its social location. Let's use some examples. Here is one that's a change of cultural location. Remember, I said that within 20 years, we have gone from peasant villages, day laborers, degraded and expendable in Israel, Palestine, to large Greco-Roman cities. We've changed culture and we've changed language. So look what kinds of things happen. There's the story in the Gospel of Mark. When they could not bring Jesus because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him, and after having dug through it, they let down the mat on which the paralytic lay. Now, what's this stuff about digging through the roof? Well, you got to think about how houses were built in that culture. There would be a large post in the middle of the room, heavy branches from the walls to the posts, covered with mud and plaster. So you had to dig through the sucker if you were going to get in through the roof. So that's what that story says they did to bring this paralyzed man to Jesus. Mark, we don't know where Mark was written. I think it was written in the Upper Galilee. Some ancient tradition says it was written elsewhere. But that's the way the story appears first. That's the first gospel written. When we go to the Gospel of Luke, look what happens. Now, because there's no way to bring him because of the crowd, they went up on the roof and let him down with his bed through the tiles in the roof. Why? Well, Luke was written in a Greco-Roman city, and the Greco-Romans didn't build their houses the same way Palestinian Israel folk did. They built tile roofs. So the vocabulary of the story changes to make it clear and understandable to people in a different culture in a different location. That's one tiny example, but they're all over the New Testament. Here's another one. This is not a change of culture, it's a change of social location. In the Lord's Prayer in the Gospel of Matthew, read, "And forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." Makes perfect sense in the life and ministry of Jesus, talking to landless peasants like himself, who were deeply in debt and frightened to death. But look what happens when that migrates into the sophisticated world of Luke. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Now, that's not a bad idea, but it ain't the original one. Whoever wrote that in the Gospel of Luke was not talking to people who were in debt. They had a different problem. So the prayer changed. Again, there are examples like this all over the New Testament. Now, maybe you think, well, but that couldn't happen in America. I got news for you. This is one I've seen myself. If you go to the ski area at Mount Ashland in Southern Oregon, and you ride the chairlift, at the top of the chairlift, somebody has put a sign tacked to a tree, and the sign has on it a quote from Psalm 121. The quote says, "I lift mine eyes unto the hills from whence cometh my help." Now, I've ridden that chairlift, and I can imagine that somebody sees that, it reminds them of the beauty of the hills around them. They're inspiring, and it's beautiful. But folks, there were no lofty, beautiful mountains in ancient Israel. In ancient Israel, what it referred to was the hills on top of which the Canaanites built their altars to the god Baal. Now read the verse and punctuate it correctly, and it reads this way. "I lift up my eyes to the hills, whence does my help come?" Note that it's a question, and the answer is in the next verse. "My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth." I wrote my dissertation on what happens to biblical texts when they migrate from an ancient Israelite Palestinian culture in antiquity to contemporary America. There's a good example, and they are all over the Bible. So social location is what I want to think about in this class, and how a changing social location changed the message of Jesus irreversibly. Here's the way we have to think about it. Think about the social location, an oral Aramaic, that's the native language of Jesus' time. An oral Aramaic story recounted face to face in small Israelite villages among totally illiterate people. And 30 years later, think about Pauline letters and written gospels in Greek, read by literate people living in large Greco cities. That is a mind-boggling change. And it's the implications of that I want to explore. So, do you understand the idea of social location? For all the academic lingo, it ain't that tough a concept. Okay? We want to talk about new social locations for the gospel. We're going to be in cities rather than villages. We're going to be in a different culture, Greco-Roman rather than Israelite, in a different language, Greek rather than Aramaic, with a different audience. The urban poor and a few retainers, remember that's the role of the group that play a role in Paul's. Rather than the world of peasants and expendables. And with the Jesus story in writing, rather than oral and face to face. In order to do that, folks, we got to face one indisputable fact. Before any, and I mean literally any, written source about Jesus or about early Christian belief or about early Christian practice, before any of that occurred, Christianity had spread to what is now Syria, Turkey, Iraq, Greece, Italy, North Africa, and as far away as Spain. I should have put Rome in there. And it had spread entirely by word of mouth among people who were illiterate. That fact is indisputable. That's a mind-boggling geographic spread. Words mean what they mean, when and where and in what context they are used. So, what that means is, Christianity had spread. There was no New Testament. There were no Gospels. There were no letters of Paul, letters of John, no letters of Peter. There was no book of Acts, no Hebrews, no James, no Revelation. Nothing that's in our Bible was written when that spread first began. It all began face to face, oral communication among people who could not read and write. So, it spread as oral tradition. People were recounting stories, memories, hearsay, and viewpoints, as fluid, vibrant, and varied as oral tradition always is. Oral tradition, folks, ain't literal. It simply isn't. We have fairly good evidence, by the way, that right after the death of Jesus, the disciples scattered rather widely. At least tradition suggests one of them as far as India. We can't verify that, but we can verify very rapid widespread. I'm going to tell you next week why they traveled all over the place. And we'll talk a little more about where they went. but they went off in wide scattered directions. When they did, there was no fixed set of Christian beliefs or rituals. There was no fixed way to think about Jesus. There was no set idea of what folks should tell others about the story of Jesus. In other words, Christianity did not start out as a unified movement. Simply didn't. There is no such thing as early Christianity. There were early Christianities, plural. Spoken differently, in different language, in different vocabulary, two people who lived in different circumstances, had different issues in their lives, different expectations, even different languages. Well, that's our story for next week. I want to trace that for you. And so next week, we're going to talk about the two things that most impact the social location of early Christianity. The first one, and by far the most influential, was writing. And the other was geographical spread. That meant new cultures, new languages. So I want to trace some of the language problems, some of the culture problems, and I want to show you what happens when oral speech converts to writing. That's our story next week. We're a little early. We have time for questions. Yeah.
One of the things you haven't talked is slaves, which play a big part. Paul in certain of his letters dealing with them. Where do they fall below your hierarchy? The slaves.
Slaves. No. Thank you for that question. It's important. The slaves are among the expected. I think I did list them, but I maybe didn't mention them. But he had asked, what about slaves? Where do they fit in this? Slaves are actually an interesting category because most of them were slaves as a result of capture and war. That meant that the folk who captured came from the whole spectrum. So we had slaves who were highly sophisticated, literate, could read and write, and very quickly became a very influential part of the body politic in the Roman world. We also had slaves who were from the bottom groups, and their life expectancy was short, their value was nothing, their life, they would simply, there were so many of them. Let me tell you, just think about this. In the Roman world, Greco-Roman world, there's an island in the Mediterranean called Delos. In antiquity, Delos was the slave mart. And what would happen after the Romans won a battle and enslaved the population, they would be brought to Delos, where they would be, dealers would, Julius Caesar claims to have sold 63,000 slaves in one day. In one day. So thank you for that. They're an important part of this. And they become a big issue in at least one of the Pauline letters. Onesimus is enslaved. But they also become an issue at the Lord's Supper. When they gathered for a meal, who brought the food? Who came early? Because they didn't have to work. Who showed up last? Says Paul, when you are drunk out of your mind. Because while you're waiting for them to show up, you booze all the wine. Well, yeah, they're important. They're around, I did say, they're around the edges of the Pauline story. There's clear concern for them in the congregations, but they're not the focus of Paul's writing. Could be. Most of them were illiterate. Other questions?
That westward spread of Christianity across
the Mediterranean in 30 years.
Yeah.
Really is remarkable when you don't have any internet.
It really is.
Wondering, are there fragments of information, I mean, for example, how do we even know it spread that far? And are there fragments of information that would say, by the time it got there and was being related in different languages, the story kind of changed?
You hit the nail on the head. That's the question we want to look at. I can tell you a little bit, right? I'll tell you a little bit right now. It's spread almost certainly because of geographical dispersion. I want to show you next week how that occurred and why. It spread primarily among non-literate people, military, slaves, so on. Do we have evidence of it? Yes. We actually have, there's an interesting reference to it in the writings in Acts where Paul says, he's headed toward Rome, but he's had planned to go to Spain because there were believers there. That's in the year 60. So there is bits and pieces of evidence like that of the spread. But yes, we have documents. By the time we get into writing, begin to have documents from that far away. You don't have writing occurring unless it had already arrived. So that's our issue for next week. How did it spread? Why did it spread? Where? And who did it?
And did the story change?
And did the story change? Oh, yes, the story changed. Good. I will show you how.
In the meeting, I forget if it's Luke or Acts or one of the other gospels, but in the meeting of the broader group of apostles, of followers, where they're speaking in tongues and stuff like that, and they're from all over the place, did that meeting perhaps plant some seeds about what the message really should contain?
The question of what the message should contain is really interesting. Paul tells us that after his conversion, he went off into the boonies for 3 years. Then he came back to Jerusalem, and he says his reason for coming back was to meet with the elders and have them check up on the story he was telling to make sure it was right. And he says, and they added nothing to my word. That's a little naive. But yeah, it's an issue. And of course, when you begin to hear loud and angry voices about false prophets, false teachings, you know that varying forms of the story are circulating. And it's causing a problem. And we're going to talk about that in detail.
You didn't put the women in those hierarchy. We'll talk about that a little bit. You've done it before, but.
I'm going to do a little bit of it next week. She asked, we didn't get the women in here. I've done a couple whole classes on that. I can't repeat it all, but we do have to think about it next week because the principal group among whom Christianity spread verbally so yeah, that's important.
And they died for me.
And we also need to think about as hierarchy begins to develop, what happens. Because it's very clear women played a role in the hierarchy early on. So yeah, we'll talk about that. Other questions?
Just an observation. We went to Pompeii a couple years ago, and it's for me. It happened. Vesuvius blew in, I think, in '97 or just not that long from when Christ lived, and it's just really fascinating to then see the opulence of that town, and then PBS has been having series about like the bakers and the slaves that worked in the bakeries and it's just kind of fascinating to have a visual of society there. And just trying to equate that with, okay, how does that influence the different social status of what you're talking about here? Yeah.
You could actually do a whole class just on the various occupations and daily routines. And life issues of each of these groups of people.
Next year.
Well done.
I got a serious problem, folks. I gave my library away.
There's the internet.
That makes what?
AI.
It makes it very difficult. Got to track stuff all over. John?
I gave most of mine.
Okay, other questions? Are we clear?
So the ancient society you were talking about had a really large slave class, but also it sounds like a fairly large class of day laborers and other people who had no political power. But I'm wondering to what extent the society lived on their work. They may not have had any political power, but perhaps they had economic force.
They did, but the problem was that they were, he's talking about the fact that while many of these day laborers and so on they really did the work that enabled society to survive. And that is true, but they were expendable and in large numbers. One of the really interesting studies that I ever read about Greco-Roman cities is the numbers of people who came from the countryside and flooded into the cities, but the city population numbers did not grow. Who was coming in? Non-inheriting sons of the family, orphans whose parents had died, people who lost their land to debt, flooded the cities in enormous numbers. Why didn't the cities grow? It's because the death rates among the lower classes of the cities were so high. So the part of the problem was these people were expendable. For most of them, their only hope was to form some kind of a community. There's no question that that was a primary motivation for the spread of early Christianity. But we also know of trade guilds, burial societies, they're called collegia, large numbers of people trying to get together in groups to survive, but the survival rates were so low and they were so expendable that they were of no account. There were some slaves who were, particularly those, for example, we have some good records of a Roman family in the city of Corinth, whose slaves had been very high-ranking senior officials in the city from which they were captured. And the value of those people to that city's administration was enormous. And so they got medical care, which you ain't gonna get. They got food, which you're not gonna get either. So yeah, there are slaves who can be influenced. How did I get on that? I don't know, but yes.
I'm gonna tell me that, but, yeah, I might have explained it, well, how did it spread so fast? And it seems like what they did, kind of an overwhelming message that it's not supposed to be this way, that you're not.
Folks, I'm deaf. I can't hear what can somebody repeat that?
I think what he's asking is in terms of, say it again.
To
talk about what is the message that made it spread so fast? And I know that's next week or whatever, but it seemed to me like it's gotta be something about, it's not supposed to be this way.
So he's asking, what was the message that could have caused this to spread so quickly? How many libraries do you want to read? There is no consensus on that subject. I have my own view. I'm not alone. I do not believe that it was message or theology. I believe it was community. Community and compassion came far before theology. The message could be told in many different forms and still convey the idea of compassion. And I think that accounts for the spread. I think it accounts also for the role. There are some scholars who would disagree. There's some scholars who argue that it was the message of death and resurrection, which is the primary focus of the writings of Paul. I'm skeptical, particularly because the vast majority of Christians in Paul's day couldn't read and write. But we'll get into that subject. It's a really important. Theologians would love to believe they're important. I think you can tell I'm skeptical. Folks, we gotta quit. Next week, we're gonna talk about the two things that originated the change: geographical spread and writing.
Bye.